Now, as you watch this, something significant is happening to the price of everything you purchase. Your next tank of gas, your upcoming grocery run, and the heating bill that will arrive in your mailbox before the month ends are all affected. You may not realize it yet, but the calculations are already in motion. The number is shifting, and it begins not in Washington or on Wall Street, but in a control room in Alberta, Canada, where a valve has just been turned down by 40%. This isn't a prediction or a worst case scenario, it's occurring in real time. By the time most people grasp the chain reaction, it will have already impacted their kitchen budgets. Stick with me for the next few minutes, as I'll explain how this will change your perspective on every price tag you encounter for the rest of the year. If you're not already subscribed to Sarah Mitchell YouTube channel, now is the time, because this one hits home. Let's rewind to the press conference in Ottawa, where Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the podium and, in the measured and precise language of a former central banker, announced something that energy analysts are already comparing to the 1973 Arab oil embargo. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply declared that Canada was invoking Emergency Export Reduction Authority under the Canada Energy Security Act, effective within 48 hours. This would impose an immediate 40% reduction in crude oil shipments to the United States, cutting 4 million barrels a day flowing south down to 2.4 million, just like that. Pipeline operators were ordered to adjust their throughput, redirecting the oil that would no longer head to American refineries, 1.6 million barrels per day, toward Asia through the Trans Mountain Pipeline to British Columbia's Pacific terminals and to Europe via Atlantic shipping routes. Canada didn't completely shut off the tap. They merely turned it down by 40%. As you'll soon understand, this is actually worse. A complete embargo would trigger international emergency protocols, activate the International Energy Agency's emergency sharing mechanisms, and invite global intervention. However, a calibrated 40% reduction exists in a legal gray zone where no international body can override it. It's a sovereign energy policy decision, perfectly designed, perfectly legal, and perfectly devastating. To grasp the significance of this moment, you need to consider the numbers, which are staggering. Canada is not just America's largest oil supplier, it is America's largest oil supplier by a margin that makes every other source seem small. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada accounts for roughly 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States. Approximately 4 million barrels flowing south every single day through the Enbridge mainline system, the Keystone Pipeline, the Express Pipeline, and several smaller conduits feeding directly into the industrial heart of America, including the Midwest. Northern Tier, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, and Montana. Now, here's where a supply disruption turns into an engineering catastrophe. Those refineries aren't just buying Canadian crude because it's nearby. They are physically, mechanically, and chemically engineered to process it. The heavy, sulfur-rich crude derived from the Alberta oil sands requires specific catalytic cracking units, specific cooling systems, and specific desulfurization processors. This equipment was designed, calibrated, and built over decades to handle one specific product from one specific geography. You cannot simply swap in light sweet crude from Texas or Saudi Arabia and expect the same output. The chemistry doesn't work. The equipment doesn't work. As Gas Buddy analyst Patrick DeHaan noted in a widely cited analysis, it's like asking someone with a diesel truck to suddenly fill up with regular gasoline. The machine isn't designed for it. This issue isn't confined to one refinery. There are 15 to 20 major U.S. refinery facilities that heavily depend on Canadian heavy crude. The Whiting Refinery in Indiana, the largest in the Midwest, processes 440,000 barrels a day and runs almost exclusively on Canadian oil. The Toledo Refinery in Ohio, the Detroit Complex in Michigan, and the Pine Bend Refinery in Minnesota all process more Canadian crude than any other facility in the country. Retooling a single major refinery costs between $2 billion and $5 billion and takes 3 to 5 years. Retooling all of them could cost between $30 billion and $100 billion before any alternative crude is processed. Stop and read that number again. $30 billion to $100 billion and 3 to 5 years. That is the wall America has just run into. The relationship between America and Canada isn't just a trading partnership, it's a physical infrastructure marriage. They share pipelines, matched refinery configurations, synchronized production schedules, and co designed processing chemistry. Decades of interdependence engineered into concrete and steel that cannot be unwound by executive order. And now it's unraveling. This situation didn't occur in a vacuum. It represents what decades of diplomatic warnings look like when they are finally ignored one time too many. Carney's government had been signaling for months through every available diplomatic channel that energy was the red line. Touching Canada's core industries would trigger an energy response. The warning was delivered, received, and ultimately ignored. But here's the deeper story, and this is the part that almost nobody in the American press is putting into the right context. 3 years ago, this weapon didn't exist. Canada had nowhere else to sell its oil. If Ottawa cut exports to the US, it would be cutting off its own revenue with no alternative buyers. The leverage was entirely in Washington's hands. However, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came online in May 2024. According to reporting from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, TMEX boosted Canada's West Coast pipeline capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000. Within the first month of operation, the combined pipelines were already running at 81% capacity. Between May 2024 and September 2025, crude oil exports to Indo-Pacific markets surged from virtually zero to an average of 571 million per month. China became Canada's second largest oil customer, with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and India all competing for contracts. The LNG Canada terminal at Kitimat began exporting natural gas to Asian markets. As oilprice.com reported just weeks ago, the value of Alberta's oil exports to Asia skyrocketed from zero before the expanded pipeline to over $84 million by October 2025. Carney himself acknowledged this transformation publicly, stating, as reported by multiple Canadian outlets, over 95% of all our energy exports went to the States. This tight interdependence, once a strength, is now a weakness. Canada built the exit, and then they used it. Announcement number 1. The refinery shutdown begins. Within 48 hours of the export reduction order, the chain reaction started exactly where physics dictated it would at the refinery. The Whiting refinery in Indiana cut throughput to 55%. The Toledo refinery in Ohio followed suit, as did the Detroit facility in Michigan and the Pine Bend refinery in Minnesota. Workers were sent home on rotating furloughs, and maintenance shutdowns accelerated. Production lines were operating at barely half capacity across the industrial Midwest. A refinery running at 55% doesn't just produce less gasoline, it produces less of everything diesel, jet fuel, heating oil, and petrochemical feedstocks. Every product derived from a barrel of crude oil is now in shorter supply, which means higher prices across the board. The gas pump is where most people first notice the impact. Wholesale gasoline prices spiked within days of the announcement. The national average, which had been hovering around $3.50 per gallon, began its ascent toward $5.50, then $6, and even $6.50. In the Midwest, the region most dependent on Canadian crude, prices pushed past $6.50 and headed towards $7.50 in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois. Lines began forming at gas stations as consumers engaged in panic buying, filling extra containers and topping off tanks every morning just in case. Some stations in Michigan and Indiana ran dry within the first week, not because the total supply was gone, but because panic buying accelerated consumption faster than deliveries could restock. Gas prices are the one price every American sees daily, displayed on 10-foot signs at every intersection across the nation. You can't miss them, and you can't pretend the crisis isn't happening when it's staring you in the face in 6-inch numbers every time you drive past a gas station. When those numbers climb past $5, $6, and $7 per gallon, The trade war stops being a distant issue covered on cable news. It becomes a personal reality. Every time you drive to work, pick up the kids, or run errands, which you used to do without a second thought, $7 per gallon makes you reconsider every single trip. But here's what most people still aren't connecting. The gas pump is the visible crisis, but diesel is the hidden crisis that affects the price of literally everything delivered by truck. In America, everything is transported by truck. Announcement number two, the invisible fuel that powers everything. Diesel prices surged alongside gasoline, and diesel is the fuel that drives the entire American economy. Every long haul truck, freight train locomotive, delivery van, construction vehicle, and agricultural tractor runs on diesel. When diesel prices spiked, trucking companies couldn't absorb the cost. Their margins typically run between 3% and 5% in a good year. They imposed emergency fuel surcharges of 25% to 40% above normal rates. The cost to ship a single truckload of goods coast to coast jumped from roughly $5,500 to $7,500, even $8,000. Amazon delivery costs increased, and FedEx and UPS added surcharges to every package. These charges passed through every layer of the supply chain until the final cost landed on consumers. The milk in your fridge was transported by a diesel truck. The bread on your counter was delivered by a diesel truck. The clothes your child is wearing right now were shipped on a diesel truck. The lumber at your hardware store, the packages on your doorstep, the medicine at your pharmacy, all of it was transported using diesel. And diesel just became 40% more expensive, meaning everything that relies on diesel is now more costly as well. The grocery store is where the chain reaction becomes impossible to ignore. Transportation costs for food surged across every category. Produce, dairy, meat, frozen goods, packaged items all saw price increases. Grocery chains initially absorbed the rising costs for about 7 to 10 days, buying time in hopes of a resolution that didn't materialize. Then the pass-through began. The average weekly grocery bill for a family of four jumped from roughly $270 to between $330 and $360. Fresh produce was hit hardest: lettuce, tomatoes, berries, anything shipped from California, Florida, or Mexico on refrigerated diesel trucks traveling thousands of miles. A gallon of milk rose by 60 to 80 cents, a dozen eggs by 40 to 55 cents, and ground beef by $1.20 to $1.50 per pound. Even bread, one of the most basic staples in the American diet, increased by 30 to 40 cents a loaf because the wheat was trucked to the mill, the flour to the bakery, and the bread to the store, all transported by trucks burning $7 diesel. The people who feel this most acutely aren't watching cable news debates about trade policy. They're the ones standing in the cereal aisle at Walmart, doing math on their phones, putting items back on the shelf because their cart is already over budget, and switching from fresh vegetables to canned goods because the canned items came from a closer warehouse. The trade war looks very different from a grocery aisle in Michigan than it does from a podium in the Rose Garden. The connection between a pipeline in Alberta and the price of a gallon of milk in a Kroger in Columbus, Ohio, seems abstract until you trace it. The pipeline feeds the refinery. The refinery produces diesel. The diesel powers the trucks, and the trucks deliver the milk. Cut the pipeline, and 3 weeks later, the milk costs more. That's it. That's the entire chain. It's that simple and that devastating. If you're finding this analysis useful, like this video and subscribe to Daily Brief, because we're only halfway through. Announcement number 3. The crisis has followed you home. If you heat your home with oil or natural gas, and tens of millions of Americans do, the trade war has just entered your living room. Approximately 5.5 million American households rely on heating oil as their primary heat source, concentrated in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Heating oil prices spiked by 40% to 60%, while natural gas, partially sourced from Canada, rose by 15% to 25%. A family spending $2,500 a year on heating now faces costs of $3,500 to $4,000. For a retired couple in Vermont living on Social Security, that's an extra $1,000 they can't afford and can't borrow. This isn't an abstraction. It's the conversation they're about to have at their kitchen table about whether to keep the house at 68 degrees or lower it to 62 to save $300 before spring arrives. The trade war has just entered the living rooms of 5.5 million American families in winter, and winter isn't even over yet. Now, let's add it all up, because Warren Buffett did exactly that, and his calculation is the most important number in this entire story. A median American household earns about $52,000 a year, roughly $4,300 a month after taxes. The oil cut adds between $150 and $250 in extra gas costs per month, between $240 and $360 in additional grocery costs, and between $80 and $125 in extra heating costs. Combined, that's an additional $470 to $735 in monthly expenses. Let's conservatively call it $500 extra per month for a family already stretched thin. In a country where over 60% of American households live paycheck to paycheck, Buffett was asked about the Canadian oil cut at the annual Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting in Omaha. He leaned into the microphone, paused, and then said something that should be quoted in every economics classroom in America. People hear oil supply cut, and they think gas prices, and they're right. Gas prices are going up. But gas is just the first domino. Diesel powers every truck in America. Every truck delivers everything you buy. So everything you buy costs more. A 40% oil cut doesn't just raise one price. It raises every price. It's a tax on the entire economy that nobody voted for. Then he made it personal in a way only Buffett can. A family making $52,000 a year is about to see about $500 extra disappear from their budget. To a billionaire, $500 a month is nothing. But to a family in Omaha, Dayton, Pine Bluff, or Tucson, $500 a month is the difference between keeping up and falling behind. That's the car payment. Here's a rewritten version of the text, maintaining the original meaning and details while making it fresh and engaging. That extra $500 a month? That's the savings for the kids' braces. It's the buffer between getting by and going into debt. And now it's gone. Then came a warning that every financial analyst should heed. When oil prices spike, consumer prices follow within weeks. However, when oil prices eventually come back down, if they do, consumer prices don't follow suit. They remain elevated. Companies use the disruption as cover to reset prices higher, and those prices become the new normal. This isn't just a temporary spike. For millions of American families, this represents a permanent increase in the cost of living. He adjusted his glasses. The arena fell silent. I've been investing for 70 years, he continued. Every oil shock I've witnessed follows the same pattern. Prices rise quickly, but they fall slowly, and they never return to their original levels. The families who can least afford it bear the burden of the difference, and nobody writes them a check to make up for it. He wasn't speculating. He had seen this script play out 5 times before. The 1973 Arab embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War spike, and the 2008 run-up. Each followed the same trajectory. Oil spikes, gas prices spike, groceries spike, heating costs rise, airlines increase fares, and companies raise prices across the board because everyone is raising prices. Eventually, oil prices may come down and gas prices may decrease, but groceries and airline fares rarely revert to their previous levels. The surcharges that were supposed to be temporary become permanent line items. Buffett has witnessed this cycle unfold 5 times. He knows precisely how it ends. Then there's Washington's response, which makes this story both infuriating and instructive. Within hours of Carney's announcement, Trump signed an executive order imposing 100% tariffs on all remaining Canadian imports, claiming it was time to make Canada pay the price for its economic aggression. But here's the problem. A 100% tariff on your largest trading partner doesn't just punish them, it punishes every American business that relies on Canadian supply chains, every consumer who buys Canadian products, and every industry integrated with cross border logistics. The damage was immediate and multifaceted. American home builders who sourced 30% of their lumber from Canada watched material costs spike overnight, adding an estimated $12,000 to $18,000 to the price of a new home. The auto industry, Ford, GM, Stellantis, saw components crossing the border 6, 7, or 8 times during assembly and began warning of production disruptions and potential plant shutdowns within weeks. Aluminum intensive manufacturers, beverage companies, aerospace suppliers, and agricultural processors importing Canadian wheat and canola all faced sudden 100% markups on critical inputs. The irony is stark. The oil cut raises energy and transportation costs, while the retaliatory tariffs increase prices for housing, cars, food, and manufactured goods. The American consumer is hit from both directions by Canada's actions and by their own government's response. The tariff is a weapon that fires in both directions, and both barrels have just been triggered. Next came the executive order directing the Department of Energy to maximize domestic production by any means necessary, fast-track drilling permits, suspend environmental reviews, and release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Powerful words, decisive optics. Here's the physical reality. American oil production is already operating near record highs. The easy oil has already been drilled. New wells take 12 to 18 months to come online, even under emergency permitting. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds roughly 370 million barrels, enough to replace the Canadian cut for approximately 230 days at reduced rates. After that, America would be even more exposed, with a depleted reserve and no backup. You cannot executive order oil out of the ground faster than geology allows. Geology doesn't respond to executive orders. Regarding OPEC, Trump reportedly made personal calls to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE's Mohammed bin Zayed, requesting emergency production increases. Both leaders reportedly listened politely but made no commitments. Why would they? OPEC has no incentive to bail out the United States in a self-created trade dispute. Every dollar that oil prices rise fills the treasuries of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Russia. Higher oil prices benefit OPEC, and asking them to lower their own revenue out of goodwill was always going to yield one answer. The only question was how politely they would decline. Then came the declaration that every energy analyst in the country immediately flagged. We will be energy independent within 6 months. We don't need Canadian oil. We never did. Let's examine the arithmetic. The United States consumes approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day, but produces roughly 13 million. The 7 million barrel per day gap isn't a policy problem or a regulatory issue, it's a physics problem. 7 million barrels per day cannot be drilled, extracted, refined, and delivered in 6 months. It likely cannot be achieved in 6 years without Canadian supply. Physics doesn't operate on a campaign timeline. This is what occurs when political power collides head-on with the laws of thermodynamics. Political power is vast. It can impose tariffs, deploy troops, freeze assets, and sign executive orders with sweeping language and bold signatures. But it cannot create a physical substance that takes millions of years to form underground and months to extract from rock. Trump is battling a physics problem with political tools, and physics always prevails. There are 2 paths forward from here, no middle ground. Path 1, negotiation. Someone in Washington blinks. Someone acknowledges that the retaliatory spiral is costing American families more than it's costing Ottawa. A deal is made. The valve opens back up, oil flows, and prices begin their slow, incomplete descent. Some of the damage is permanent. Buffett's law doesn't get suspended. However, the acute phase ends. This path requires something that the current political environment makes extraordinarily difficult: the admission that the initial escalation was a miscalculation. Path 2, the spiral. No negotiation occurs. Canada maintains the reduction. American refineries operating at 55% capacity become the new normal. Supply shortfalls deepen, gas at $7 becomes $8, and grocery bills climb another 15%. Midwest manufacturing starts shutting down due to a lack of materials. Republican senators in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Minnesota, the states where the pain is most acutely felt, where refineries are slowing and grocery lines are forming, must choose between party loyalty and constituent survival. Political pressure builds, but pressure takes time. In this case, time is measured in family budgets that are already breaking. There is no scenario in which the average American family does not pay a significant price for this moment. The only question is how long and how permanent that price will be. The people bearing the highest cost for this crisis are those who can least afford it. Wealthy families can absorb an extra $500 a month without altering their lifestyles. Middle-class families cut back, cancel subscriptions, and delay purchases. But families living paycheck to paycheck, over 60% of American households, have nothing left to trim. For them, an additional $500 a month isn't just belt tightening, it's a missed rent payment. It's the choice between gas to get to work or groceries to feed the kids. It's the moment when the abstraction of trade policy becomes a concrete human crisis at a kitchen table in the heart of America. Buffett articulated it with devastating simplicity. When the price goes up because of a trade war, who pays? Not the politicians, not the billionaires, not the people who initiated it. It's the family in Omaha trying to make it through the month. Canada turned the valve, Trump fired back, and the price is being paid right now, not by governments, not by corporations, not by political parties, but by every family in America that drives to work, heats their home, and buys groceries. The oil is still flowing, just 40% less of it. And that 40% is the difference between getting by and going under. The pipeline runs from Alberta to your kitchen table, and right now it's running dry. So, let me leave you with the questions that truly matter, not the political theater, but the real questions. Can Trump's 6-month energy independence promise withstand a physical reality where even the most optimistic domestic production scenarios fall 7 million barrels per day short? What will happen to Republican political coalitions in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Minnesota when gas remains at $7 in 6 months and the refineries are still operating at half capacity? And the question Buffett answered, but Washington still hasn't. When prices rise this quickly and this sharply, who absorbs the permanent increase after the crisis fades? Leave your answers in the comments. I read every single one. If this message reached you before you felt it at the gas pump, share it with someone who needs to understand what's coming. That's how Sarah Mitchell YouTube channel operates, not through algorithms or headlines, but by tracing the chain reaction all the way to your kitchen table. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next domino is already in motion.